The bridge of the Valkyrie hummed with the soft sounds of machines working through the endless night of space. And Jake Morrison stood near the main viewport watching stars drift past like distant memories, frozen in time and light that had traveled for years just to reach his eyes in this moment of quiet patrol duty, along the outer rim of human-controlled territory, where nothing much ever happened except the occasional meteor shower or passing comet that lit up their sensors for a few brief seconds before disappearing back into the cosmic void from which it came. Jake had commanded the Valkyrie for 3 years now, and in that time they had mapped 17 star systems and cataloged 42 planets, and established first contact with 2 minor species who seemed more frightened of humans than interested in friendship, which was becoming a pattern that Jake found frustrating because Earth had sent them out here to build bridges, not walls. But the galaxy seemed to have already decided that humans were dangerous, simply because they came from a world that would kill most other species within hours of landing on its surface with its crushing gravity and violent weather, and predators that hunted in packs with terrifying intelligence. Megan Curtis sat at the second command station reviewing supply reports and maintenance schedules, with the focused attention she brought to everything she did, and Jake trusted her completely because she had saved their lives at least twice in situations where his own judgment had been clouded by emotion or fatigue, and she possessed the rare ability to see 3 steps ahead of any problem before it became a crisis, which made her the perfect second in command for a ship operating so far from any support or backup if things went wrong in the ways things often went wrong out here on the frontier. The communication station suddenly erupted with a burst of static that made everyone on the bridge look up from their tasks, and Nina Brooks leaned forward in her chair, adjusting frequencies and filters trying to isolate the source of the interference that cut through their normal monitoring channels like a knife through silence, and her fingers danced across the controls with practiced efficiency as she worked to clean up the signal that was clearly trying to tell them something important. If only they could hear it clearly enough to understand what was being said. Nina looked back at Jake with wide eyes and said she had a distress call coming through on an open emergency frequency. But the signal was weak and breaking up badly, like whoever was sending it was either very far away or their transmitter was damaged or both, and she was trying to boost it now. But he should hear this right away because the little she could make out suggested something bad was happening. And they might be the only ones close enough to receive the call for help that someone was desperately trying to send out into the uncaring darkness. Jake moved to stand behind Nina's station and listened as she played back the cleaned-up version of the transmission, and a voice came through speaking in a language that the ship's computer quickly identified as Volani, which was a species Jake had heard of but never encountered personally, because they rarely traveled far from their home systems and preferred to conduct their trading through intermediaries rather than risk the dangers of deep space exploration where pirates and hostile empires waited for easy prey to wander into their territory unprotected and unprepared. The translation played through the bridge speakers, and the desperation in the voice was clear, even through the electronic rendering that turned alien sounds into human words, and the speaker identified themselves as coming from the colony ship, Peaceful Dawn, and said they were under attack by Kresh warships and their shields were failing, and their engines were damaged beyond repair, and they needed help immediately because their children were dying, and their elders were dying, and everyone was dying, and please, if anyone could hear this message, please come help them, before it was too late to save anyone at all. Jake felt something cold settle into his stomach because he knew about the Kresh Dominion from intelligence briefings and historical records, and they were bad news in every possible way, and built their empire on conquest and slavery, and believed that mercy was a weakness that only inferior species practiced, and they had destroyed entire civilizations just to prove they could and faced no consequences because the Galactic Council was too afraid or too corrupt to stand up to them and enforce any kind of justice or accountability for their crimes. Megan was already pulling up the coordinates embedded in the distress signal and plotting potential courses to reach that location, and she looked up at Jake and told him they were 47 light-years away from the source of the transmission, and at maximum speed they could reach it in about 6 hours, but that would push their engines past recommended limits, and Danny Wright would probably have strong opinions about that kind of treatment of his beloved machinery that he maintained, with the dedication of a parent caring for a sick child. Jake didn't hesitate for even a second and told Megan to plot the fastest course possible and damn the recommended limits, because someone needed help, and they were the only ship in range to provide it, and he would deal with Danny's complaints Later, after they had saved whoever they could save from the crash attack that was happening right now, while they stood here debating fuel consumption and engine stress and other concerns that seemed pathetically small compared to the lives that were being lost with every passing moment they delayed, Lisa Chen brought up the navigation plot on the main screen and showed Jake the route she had calculated that would take them through an asteroid field that most pilots would never risk. But she knew the Valkyrie could handle it, and knew her own skills were good enough to thread that needle and cut 90 minutes off their travel time, which might mean the difference between arriving in time to save lives or arriving in time to only count bodies and document another atrocity for the historical records that no one would ever be punished for committing. Jake approved the route and called down to engineering, where Danny Wright answered with his usual cheerful tone that vanished instantly when Jake told him what they needed and why they needed it. And there was a long pause before Danny said he would get it done and keep the engines running no matter what it took, because he had heard the distress call too, since all ship announcements played through engineering as well, and there was no way he was going to let some innocent people die just because he was worried about maintenance schedules and component stress ratings. Kevin Hughes called up from the medical bay and said he had heard the situation and was preparing for mass casualties and setting up additional beds in the cargo bay if needed, and sterilizing every piece of equipment they had and pulling together all their medical supplies, because he had no idea what Volani physiology was like. But he would do his best to keep anyone alive who made it onto their ship in whatever condition they arrived, and Jake thanked him and felt grateful that his crew understood what needed to be done without requiring long explanations or convincing arguments. The Valkyrie surged forward as the engines powered up to maximum output, and the ship shuddered slightly as it accelerated past the safety limits that were designed to protect both the vessel and its crew from the kind of stress that could tear metal apart or turn human bodies into broken bags of meat and bone if the inertial dampeners failed even for a fraction of a second. But everyone on board had accepted that risk the moment they signed up to serve on a deep space exploration vessel, where danger was just part of the job description. Jake stood in the center of the bridge and thought about Earth and the world that had forged humanity into what they were today, and the gravity that made their bones dense and their muscles strong, and the diseases that made their immune systems aggressive and adaptable, and the predators that taught them to work together and never give up, even when the odds seemed impossible. Because giving up meant death, and humanity had decided a long time ago that they would rather die fighting than die cowering, and that philosophy had carried them from caves to cities to the stars themselves. The other species in the galaxy called Earth a death world and called humans Deathworlders and meant it as an insult or a warning. But Jake had always thought they were missing the point, because yes, Earth was dangerous, and yes, it had killed billions over the course of human history. But it had also taught humanity the most important lesson any species could learn, which was that life was precious and worth fighting for, and worth dying for, if that was what it took to protect those who could, not protect themselves from the predators that saw weakness as an invitation to attack. Ryan Cooper ran tactical drills with his weapon crews and made sure every system was ready for whatever they might find when they dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the coordinates of the distress signal, and Jake was glad to have Ryan aboard, because the man was absolutely ruthless when it came to combat efficiency and never hesitated to use every advantage they had, even if other species considered some of their weapons or tactics to be barbaric or excessive, because Ryan understood that in a real fight there was no such thing as excessive force, there was only survival or death. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness, despite the fact that they were moving faster than most ships in the galaxy could manage, and Jake paced the bridge like a caged animal, while his crew whoa. The Valkyrie dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and the universe snapped back into normal space with a jolt that Jake felt in his bones, and the main viewport cleared to reveal a scene that made his blood run cold, and every instinct he possessed screamed that they had arrived too late to save anyone from the horror that was unfolding before their eyes in the silent darkness between the stars, where no one could hear screams or pleas for mercy that would never be granted by the attackers, who had come here to kill. The peaceful dawn hung in space like a broken toy that a child had smashed in anger and forgotten, and debris surrounded the colony ship in a cloud of metal fragments and frozen atmosphere that sparkled in the light of the nearby sun, and the hull was breached in at least a dozen places that Jake could see, and fire still burned in some sections, consuming what little oxygen remained in those compartments and turning living beings into ash and memory. Ryan Cooper spoke in a voice that was carefully controlled, but Jake could hear the fury underneath, and said he counted 12 Kresh warships circling the Villani colony ship like predators around wounded prey, and they were still firing their weapons into the defenseless vessel, even though it was clear the battle was over, and the Villani had no way to fight back or escape, or do anything except die, while their killers continued to pour fire into them with methodical precision. Lisa Chen pointed at the tactical display and said something that made Jake want to smash his fist through the console and scream at the universe for its cruelty, and she indicated the small bright dots that represented escape pods, and there were dozens of them scattered across the battle space, and the Kresh warships were systematically targeting each one and destroying it with single shots that turned fragile life pods into expanding clouds of gas and debris, and the murdered hope of families who thought they might survive if they could just get away from the dying ship. Jake watched through the viewport as another escape pod exploded in a brief flash of light that marked the end of however many Villani had crowded into that small metal shell, hoping against hope that someone would come to rescue them. And he counted the seconds it took for that light to fade and wondered how many children had just died, and how many parents and how many beings who had never hurt anyone in their entire lives and were now just particles of organic matter spreading through the vacuum. Nina Brooks turned to Jake and asked if she should try to hail the Kresh vessels and demand they cease fire, and Jake nodded because protocol required it, even though he already knew what the response would be, and he was proven right. 30 seconds. Later, when Nina played the reply through the bridge speakers and a harsh voice filled with contempt and amusement answered their transmission with words that would be remembered and quoted for generations to come. The Kresh commander identified himself as war leader Krath, and asked what business humans had interfering in Kresh territorial expansion, and he laughed when Jake explained that this sector was not Kresh territory, and demanded that they stop firing on civilians and escape pods immediately. And Krath laughed again and said that humans were a primitive species, who understood nothing of galactic politics or the natural order, where the strong took what they wanted, and the weak died because that was what weakness deserved. Krath continued and said that humans should turn their pathetic little ship around and run back to their tiny corner of space, before the Kresh decided to add them to the list of species that needed to learn proper respect for their betters, and he suggested that perhaps humans would make good slaves once they were properly broken and taught to obey without question, the way all inferior beings should behave when confronted with the obvious superiority of Kresh military might and cultural achievement. Jake let Krath finish his speech and waited through the silence that followed, and then he spoke in a voice that was calm and cold as the space between stars, and he told Krath that he was giving the Kresh one chance, and only one chance, to cease fire immediately and withdraw from the system and allow the Valkyrie to rescue any surviving Villani, and if Krath refused this offer, then what happened next would be entirely the responsibility of the Kresh, and their families would receive whatever remained of their bodies in boxes that might be very small. Krath laughed so hard that the audio feed distorted, and then he cut the transmission and the tactical display showed all 12 Kresh warships turning toward the Valkyrie and powering up their weapon systems, and Ryan Cooper looked at Jake and asked for permission to engage. And Jake realized that he was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed, and that whatever happened in the next few minutes would define humanity's relationship with the galaxy for decades or centuries to come. Jake thought about the burning escape pods and the families dying while calling for help that never came, and the Kresh commander laughing about slavery and superiority, while innocent beings were murdered around him, and Jake realized that some lines needed to be crossed and some messages needed to be sent, and sometimes civilization required someone to stand up and say enough, and mean it with actions, not just words. He turned to Megan Curtis and said the words that would start everything, and told her to release all weapon safeties and remove all engagement limiters and authorize full combat protocols, and she met his eyes and understood exactly what he was ordering and what it meant, and she nodded once and entered the commands that would transform their exploration vessel into something the Kresh had never encountered before and would never forget if any of them survived to carry the memory. Jake took a deep breath and looked around his bridge at the people he had served with for 3 years and trusted with his life on countless occasions, and he saw the same cold fury in their eyes that he felt in his own chest, and he knew they all understood what they were about to do and why they were about to do it, and not one of them hesitated or questioned or suggested mercy for the Kresh who had shown no mercy to their victims. Ryan Cooper reported that all weapons were online and ready, and that he had target locks on every crash vessel, and was tracking their movements and anticipating their maneuvers, and had already calculated firing solutions that would maximize damage and minimize ammunition expenditure. And he was ready to demonstrate why human military doctrine had been written in blood over thousands of years of warfare against enemies who were just as dangerous and just as willing to fight to the death. Lisa Chen reported that she had calculated evasion patterns and attack runs, and was ready to push the ship through maneuvers that would make most species pass out from the acceleration forces, but that human bodies could endure thanks to their Deathworld evolution and the training they had all undergone in high-gravity environments that taught them to function even when their bones felt like they were breaking and their organs felt like they were being crushed. Danny Wright called up from engineering and said the engines were running hot but stable, and he could give them everything they needed and more if necessary. And he had rerouted power from non-essential systems to weapons and shields and engines. And the Valkyrie was ready to show these Kresh bastards what happened when you made the mistake of threatening a ship full of humans who had decided that enough was enough and justice needed to be served. Jake looked at the tactical display one more time and saw the Kresh ships moving into attack formation, and he saw another escape pod explode on the screen, and he saw the wreckage of the Peaceful Dawn, and thought about the 3,000 Villani who had been aboard that ship when it left port, carrying families and children and elders who just wanted to find a new home, somewhere peaceful, where they could live their lives without fear of violence. He turned to Ryan Cooper and gave the order that would change everything and said weapons free and engage at will. And Ryan smiled without any humor in it, and his fingers moved across his controls with the precision of a concert pianist, and the Valkyrie opened fire with every weapon system they possessed, and the Kresh were about to learn a lesson that would be written in fire and blood and transmitted across the galaxy as a warning. The first Kresh warship died before it could even return fire, and the railgun round punched through its shields like they were made of paper, and continued through the hull, and detonated the reactor core, and the ship came apart in a blast that scattered debris across 1,000 kilometers and sent shockwaves that rattled the shields of the other Kresh vessels, and made them suddenly realize that maybe they had made a very serious mistake. The Valkyrie spun and dived and climbed through three-dimensional space with movements that should have been impossible for a ship that size, and Lisa Chen threw the vessel through maneuvers that made the hull groan and the crew grunt against forces that tried to push them through their seats, but human bodies held together where frailer species would have been pulped, and the ship danced through the Kresh formation like a shark through a school of fish. Ryan Cooper fired missiles that tracked and hunted and refused to be shaken by countermeasures, and each one found its target and exploded with fury that came from human engineering and human determination to build weapons that worked every single time without fail, because human history taught that unreliable weapons meant dead soldiers, and dead soldiers meant lost battles, and lost battles meant the end of everything. A second, Cray. The battle became something that military historians would study for generations, and tacticians would use as examples in academies across 100 worlds, and the Kresh ships tried to form defensive positions, but the Valkyrie moved through their formations like a blade through silk and left destruction in its wake, as Ryan Cooper demonstrated the difference between species who fought because they enjoyed conquest, and species who fought because they refused to accept defeat, no matter how impossible the odds. The fourth Kresh warship took a missile salvo that overwhelmed its point defense systems, and the explosions walked up the length of its hull from stern to bow and left nothing but drifting scrap metal and frozen bodies that tumbled through space. In the aftermath, and Jake watched it happen and felt nothing except the grim satisfaction of knowing that ship would never destroy another escape pod or murder another family fleeing from violence. Lisa Chen threw the Valkyrie into a corkscrew roll that brought them underneath the Kresh formation, and Ryan Cooper took advantage of the angle to target the vulnerable engine sections of 3 ships simultaneously, and the railguns spoke again, with their deep bass thunder that Jake felt through the deck plates, and all 3 targets lost power and began drifting helplessly as their crews scrambled to restore systems that had been reduced to molten slag by projectiles moving at significant fractions of the speed of light. Megan Curtis monitored the shield status and called out warnings when Kresh weapons managed to score hits, but the Valkyrie's defensive systems held because human engineers had designed them with paranoid assumptions about enemy capabilities and built-in redundancies that other species considered excessive until they saw them work under combat conditions that would have left lesser vessels as expanding clouds of superheated plasma. The remaining Kresh ships finally broke formation completely and scattered in different directions as their commanders realized that staying together just made them easier targets, and they tried to use their numerical advantage by attacking from multiple vectors, but Lisa Chen predicted their movements and positioned the ship to maximize Ryan's firing solutions and minimize their exposure to enemy weapons. And the Kresh discovered that tactics only worked when your opponent followed the same rules you did. Jake watched the tactical display and saw the Kresh ships trying to maneuver for advantage, and he saw his crew working with the smooth efficiency of people who had trained together for years and trusted each other completely. And he realized that this was what made human military forces so dangerous, because they did not just fight as individuals, they fought as a unified organism, where every part supported every other part, and failure was simply not acceptable. One of the Kresh ships made a run toward the peaceful dawn, and Jake realized they were trying to use the destroyed colony ship as cover, and he told Lisa Chen to intercept, and she pushed the engines past red line limits, and Danny Wright swore over the comm channel, but kept the power flowing, and the Valkyrie closed the distance in seconds, and Ryan Cooper put a railgun round through the Kresh ship's bridge that killed everyone in the command section instantly. Another Kresh vessel tried to run, and Lisa Chen plotted an intercept course that cut across its trajectory, and Ryan Cooper launched a spread of missiles that the Kresh ship tried desperately to evade, but there was no escaping weapons that had been designed by humans who understood pursuit and the mathematics of orbital mechanics and the unforgiving physics of space combat, where every action had consequences and every mistake was final. The missiles detonated in a pattern that bracketed the fleeing ship, and the overlapping blast waves crushed its hull like a tin can. And Jake heard someone on the bridge say that 6 ships were down and 6 remained, and he thought about the escape pods the Kresh had destroyed and decided that 6 wasn't enough because justice demanded more than half measures, and mercy was something you earned by showing mercy yourself. Krath's ship finally entered the fight directly, and it was larger than the other Kresh vessels and better armed, and its shields held against the first missile salvo Ryan Cooper launched, and Krath broadcast a challenge saying that he would kill the humans personally, and prove that the Kresh Dominion did not fear primitive Deathworlders who thought they could challenge empires that had ruled the galaxy for millennia. Jake told Nina Brooks to open a channel, and he spoke directly to Krath and said that the Kresh had exactly one chance to surrender and save the lives of his remaining crew members, and that chance was expiring in about 30 seconds, and after that Jake would hunt down every Kresh ship in the system, and any that tried to escape would die trying, and their bodies would drift forever in the cold dark, as a warning to others who thought that murdering civilians was acceptable behavior. Krath responded with curses and threats and fired every weapon his ship possessed at the Valkyrie, in a massive salvo that lit up the tactical display with warnings, and Lisa Chen rolled the ship and jinked and dodged, and the human inertial dampeners struggled to compensate for forces that would have killed most species, but the crew held together and the shields held, and Ryan Cooper waited patiently for his moment with the calm of a predator who knew that prey always made mistakes. When Krath's ship completed its attack run and had to cycle its weapons for another volley, Ryan Cooper fired everything the Valkyrie possessed in a single devastating strike that focused all their offensive power on one target, and Krath's shields collapsed under the assault, and the hull breached in multiple locations, and the ship began venting atmosphere and debris, and Jake watched it happen and felt no pity for the Kresh commander who had laughed while murdering innocents. The remaining Kresh ships saw their leader's vessel crippled and dying and finally understood that they could not win this fight, and they tried to disengage and flee, but Jake had meant what he said about hunting them all down, and he gave the order to pursue and destroy, and the crew responded with grim efficiency because they all remembered the burning escape pods and the murdered families. Lisa Chen tracked each fleeing vessel and plotted intercept courses, and the Valkyrie pursued them one by one, and Ryan Cooper destroyed them methodically and precisely, and without any wasted ammunition or unnecessary theatrics, because this wasn't about showing off, it was about sending a message that would echo across the galaxy that humanity protected those who could not protect themselves and punished those who preyed on the weak. 2 ships tried to make a coordinated escape and split off in different directions, hoping to divide the Valkyrie's attention, but Lisa Chen simply picked the closer target and accelerated to pursuit speed, while Ryan Cooper locked missiles on the farther vessel and launched a fire and forget strike that tracked the crash ship through its evasive maneuvers and detonated against its engines and left it drifting dead in space. The closer ship died seconds later when Ryan Cooper put a railgun round through its reactor core, and the explosion lit up the viewport like a small sun that burned brief and hot and then faded to nothing, leaving only expanding gas and fragments of what had once been a warship, full of Kresh warriors who thought they were invincible until they met someone who refused to accept their claims of superiority. One Kresh vessel managed to get its faster-than-light drive online and began the jump sequence, and Jake thought for a moment it might escape. But Ryan Cooper had anticipated this and already had firing solutions calculated for the drive signature, and he put 3 missiles directly into the forming jump field. And the interaction between the warheads and the artificial space-time distortion created an explosion that ripped the ship apart at the molecular level. The last Kresh ship broadcast a surrender signal and powered down its weapons, and Jake considered accepting it for about 5 seconds before he remembered the Villani escape pods exploding one after another, while families screamed for help that never came, and he told Ryan Cooper to fire, and the ship died without ceremony or recognition, because mercy was earned through mercy shown, and the crash had shown none. Silence fell across the bridge, and the tactical display showed nothing but debris fields and the crippled hulk of Krath's command ship, still venting atmosphere and bodies, and Jake stood in the center of his bridge and looked at the destruction. They had wrought and felt no triumph or joy, only grim satisfaction that justice had been served, even if it came too late for most of the Villani who had died calling for help. Ryan Cooper reported all hostile vessels destroyed or disabled, and asked if they should finish off Krath's ship, and Jake thought about it, and decided that one survivor might be useful to carry the message back to the Kresh Dominion about what happened when you attacked civilians while humans were watching. So he ordered Ryan to leave the command ship drifting, but to destroy its weapons and engines, so it could do nothing but wait for rescue. Megan Curtis ran damage assessments and reported that the Valkyrie had taken hits but nothing critical. And Danny Wright confirmed from engineering that all systems were functional, though they would need proper repairs at a shipyard eventually, and Kevin Hughes reported minor casualties among the crew, mainly from the high G-forces during combat maneuvers, but nothing that required immediate evacuation or emergency medical intervention. Jake took a deep breath and felt the adrenaline starting to fade from his system, and his hands were. The hangar bay of the Valkyrie filled with Villani survivors who emerged from their escape pods on shaking legs and looked around at their rescuers with expressions that mixed gratitude and shock and disbelief that anyone had come to save them, and Kevin Hughes and his medical team moved among them, quickly assessing injuries and providing emergency care, while Nina Brooks tried to coordinate the chaos and help the Villani understand they were safe now. The Villani were smaller than humans and more delicate, with thin frames that looked fragile, next to the muscular builds that came from evolving under Earth's heavy gravity, and their skin had a pale blue tint that reminded Jake of ice, and their large eyes seemed to take in everything with wonder and fear and confusion about what had just happened and who these humans were that had appeared from nowhere to fight their battle. Kevin Hughes worked frantically, because what humans would consider minor injuries were life-threatening to the Villani, and their biology was different enough that he had to constantly adjust his treatments and dosages while his team set up additional medical beds in the cargo bay and tried to keep the most severely wounded alive long enough to stabilize them and figure out proper treatment protocols for a species they had never encountered before today. Jake walked through the hangar and saw families clinging to each other, and children crying and elders trying to comfort the young while dealing with their own trauma, and he counted heads and realized that of the 3,000 Villani who had been aboard the Peaceful Dawn, fewer than 200 had made it to escape pods in time, and fewer still had survived long enough to be rescued by the Valkyrie. An older Villani approached Jake with the help of a younger one, who supported him as he walked and introduced himself through the translator device that Nina Brooks had provided as Elder Counselor Tharn, who had been the leader of the colony mission, and he looked at Jake with tears streaming down his face and said words that Jake would remember for the rest of his life, about how they had broadcast their distress call to 12 different systems, and only the humans had answered. Tharn explained that the other species had all sent back the same basic message saying they were sorry, but could not risk conflict with the Kresh Dominion over one colony ship, and they hoped the Villani would understand that galactic politics were complicated and sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good, and the Villani should try to negotiate with the Kresh if possible and surrender if necessary. Jake listened and felt anger building in his chest again, but kept it controlled because these people did not need to see his rage. They needed to see strength and reassurance. And he told Tharn that humans had a different philosophy about answering distress calls, and that his crew had done what they believed was right, regardless of politics or consequences, and that the Villani were safe now and would remain under human protection. Megan Curtis appeared at Jake's shoulder and spoke quietly, so the Villani would not hear, and told him they had a problem, because long-range sensors had detected Kresh reinforcements, responding to the distress calls that their destroyed ships had managed to broadcast before they died, and the incoming fleet was much larger than what they had just fought and included at least 3 heavy battleships plus support vessels. Jake followed Megan back to the bridge and looked at the tactical display showing the approaching Kresh fleet and did some quick calculations about their arrival time and the Valkyrie's current condition and the presence of 200 refugees aboard who needed medical care. And he realized they could not fight this many ships with their ammunition depleted and their shields weakened and their engines stressed beyond safe limits. Lisa Chen had already plotted an escape course and said they could make it to human-controlled space if they left now, and pushed the engines hard and took a route through a nearby nebula that would hide their trail from Kresh sensors and give them time to send word ahead for reinforcements. But it would take several days to traverse the nebula, and every hour would be tense, waiting to see if the Kresh found their trail. Jake approved the route immediately and told Danny Wright to give them everything the engines had left, and they jumped to faster than light speed, just as the first Kresh reinforcement vessels began arriving at the battle site and found only debris, fields, and their commander's crippled ship, broadcasting the humiliating story of how a single human vessel had destroyed 12 Kresh warships. The journey through the nebula was exactly as tense as Jake had feared, and every sensor ghost made the crew jump, and every fluctuation in the nebula's magnetic fields looked like it might be a Kresh ship hunting them, and they ran silent with minimal emissions while the Villani refugees tried to adjust to life aboard a human vessel and slowly began to relax as they realized they were truly safe. Tharn spent time with Jake and asked questions about Earth and humanity, and seemed fascinated by every answer he received, and he could not understand how humans functioned in such high gravity, or consumed foods that would poison most other species, or needed so little sleep compared to the Villani, who required at least 12 hours of rest per day to maintain their health and cognitive functions. Jake explained about Deathworlds and how Earth had shaped humanity through millions of years of evolution, and how the challenges that seemed impossible to other species were just normal life for humans who had grown up learning to adapt or die, and how that same philosophy carried over to space exploration, where humanity refused to accept limitations that other species considered absolute. Tharn asked the question that Jake had been expecting, and wanted to know why humans had intervened when even powerful species with advanced militaries had refused to help. And Jake gave the answer that would be recorded in Villani history books for generations, and said that humans knew what it meant to be helpless and to cry out for help and hear only silence, and that Earth's history taught them to help others, because someday they might need help themselves. Tharn wept again and said that his people had thought they understood civilization, and had believed the Galactic Council represented the highest ideals of cooperation and mutual support, but the Kresh attack and the lack of response from other species had shattered those beliefs, and now he wondered if the galaxy was really just a collection of predators and prey, with no real justice or morality beyond strength. Jake told Tharn that he could not speak for the galaxy, but could speak for humanity, and said that humans believed in protecting those who could not protect themselves, and standing up to bullies even when it was dangerous, and that if the Galactic Council did not represent those values, then maybe it was time for new voices to be heard in galactic politics. Their conversation was interrupted by alarms, and Ryan Cooper reported that Kresh ships had entered the nebula behind them and were following their trail, and Jake realized that the hunt had become serious, and the Kresh were not going to let this insult stand without punishment, and they wanted revenge for their destroyed fleet and wanted to silence the story before it could spread across the galaxy. Lisa Chen adjusted their course to take them deeper into the nebula, where the magnetic storms were stronger and sensor interference was worse, and she scattered false trails using modified probes and debris from their cargo bay, and led the Kresh on a chase through clouds of ionized gas that played havoc with targeting systems and navigation, and made pursuit a nightmare of dead ends and false contacts. Danny Wright worked miracles in engineering and kept the damaged systems running through improvisation, and jury-rigged repairs that would make safety inspectors scream, but kept the ship moving and kept them ahead of the pursuing Kresh, who were gaining slowly but steadily as their fresh ships and full crews overcame the advantages that desperation and skill had given the Valkyrie. Nina Brooks maintained constant contact with human military command and transmitted everything that had happened and sent copies of all their sensor logs and the recordings of the Kresh destroying escape pods, and Jake knew that even if they did not survive this chase, the truth would get out and the galaxy would know what had happened here, and what humans were willing to do to protect innocent lives. The Villani watched the humans work and began to understand that they were seeing something rare and precious that most species had lost somewhere in their evolution toward comfort and civilization, and they saw beings who refused to quit even when logic said they should surrender, and who fought not because they enjoyed violence but because they believed some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. Tharn told Jake that his people had a saying about those who stood against darkness when others fled, and that humans embodied that saying better than any species he had ever encountered, and that if they survived this journey, the Villani would make sure the galaxy knew the truth about who the real monsters were and who the real heroes were. Jake smiled grimly and said survival was the plan, and told Lisa Chen to plot one more series of false trails and then make a run for the Nebula exit where human reinforcements were supposed to be waiting, and he hoped that Command had taken his warning seriously and sent enough firepower to make the Kresh think twice about continuing their pursuit into human territory, where the rules of engagement would be very different. The Valkyrie burst from the nebula with the Kresh fleet close behind, and for one terrible moment, Jake thought they had miscalculated and arrived too early and would face the enemy alone until his sensors cleared and showed 3 human cruisers and a carrier group waiting in formation exactly where they were supposed to be, and he felt relief wash through him, followed immediately by tension, because now came the hard part of explaining to the Kresh that they had made a very serious mistake. Admiral Patricia Cole commanded the human fleet from the heavy cruiser Defender, and her voice came through the communications channel with calm authority that spoke of decades of military service and countless battles fought and won, and she told Jake to fall back behind the human lines and let her handle the diplomatic discussions that were about to happen, though she used the word diplomatic in a tone that suggested violence was very much on the table. The Kresh fleet emerged from the nebula and found themselves facing a force that matched their numbers and exceeded their individual ship capabilities, and the Kresh admiral, broadcasting on all frequencies demanding that the humans surrender the Valkyrie and its crew immediately for trial as war criminals who had attacked Kresh forces without provocation and murdered Kresh warriors in violation of all accepted rules of civilized warfare. Admiral Cole listened to the entire demand without interruption, and then requested permission to present evidence before any discussions of surrender or trials continued, and the Kresh admiral agreed with obvious contempt in his voice because he believed that humans were primitive species who did not understand galactic law and would quickly realize their mistake and hand over their criminals to proper Kresh justice. Admiral Cole transmitted the complete sensor logs from the Valkyrie, showing the Kresh systematically destroying Villani escape pods and executing civilians who were fleeing from a destroyed colony ship, and she included audio recordings of Kresh commanders laughing about the murders and boasting about their superiority and their right to kill anyone they deemed inferior, and the transmissions went out on open channels where any species monitoring this sector could receive them. The Kresh admiral tried to interrupt and claim the recordings were fabricated, but Admiral Cole continued speaking in that same calm tone and explained that under human law, and under the laws of most civilized species, the deliberate targeting of civilian refugees constituted genocide and war crimes, and that humanity had a very clear policy regarding such actions, which was to hunt down those responsible and ensure they faced justice. The Kresh admiral demanded to know what gave humans the right to enforce their laws on Kresh citizens in Kresh territory, and Admiral Cole responded that first, this was not Kresh territory according to any galactic maps or treaties, and second, that crimes against sapient beings were everyone's business regardless of borders, and third, that humanity would not tolerate genocide in any sector they could reach, and the Kresh should consider that a promise, not a threat. The Kresh admiral made a mistake then and laughed and pointed out that his fleet was powerful and fresh and outnumbered the human vessels, and that perhaps humans needed to learn the same lesson the Villani had learned about the consequences of defying Kresh power, and he ordered his ships to attack formation and powered up weapons, and Admiral Cole simply said affirmative and gave the order to engage. What followed was not a battle but a demonstration, and Jake watched from the Valkyrie's bridge as human military doctrine that had been refined through centuries of warfare was applied with devastating efficiency against an opponent who had never faced enemies willing to accept casualties in pursuit of victory. And the Kresh discovered that their empire had been built on conquering species who surrendered easily. The human cruisers moved in coordinated patterns that maximized their firing arcs while minimizing their exposure, and their weapons spoke with precision that came from endless drills and training exercises and real combat experience, and every shot was calculated, and every maneuver had a purpose, and the Kresh fleet found itself being systematically dismantled by an enemy that fought like a unified organism. The carrier launched fighter wings that swarmed the Kresh capital ships and exploited gaps in their point defense systems, and hit vulnerable systems with surgical strikes that degraded enemy combat effectiveness without necessarily destroying the ships outright, because Admiral Cole wanted survivors to carry the message back to the Kresh Dominion about what humanity was capable of when properly motivated. The Kresh tried to use their numerical advantage and attacked from multiple vectors, but the human ships had been designed with such tactics in mind, and their defensive systems held, while their weapons continued to fire with mechanical regularity. And ship after ship in the Kresh fleet lost shields and weapons and engines and began drifting helplessly, while their crews scrambled to abandon ship. One of the Kresh battleships managed to land a solid hit on the defender, and Admiral Cole calmly reported moderate damage to her forward sections and continued coordinating the battle without any change in her voice or demeanor. And Jake realized he was watching someone who had seen combat so many times that personal danger barely registered compared to the larger tactical picture. The human ships focused their fire on that battleship and reduced it to scrap within minutes. And the message was clear that any ship that managed to damage a human vessel would be prioritized for destruction, and the other Kresh battleships suddenly became much more cautious in their approach and tried to maintain distance while still contributing to the fight. The battle lasted less than an hour before the Kresh admiral broadcast surrender, and Admiral Cole accepted on condition that the Kresh fleet would immediately withdraw from this sector and never return, and would pay substantial reparations to the surviving Villani, and would broadcast a message throughout their empire explaining what had happened and why, and agreeing to respect human protected zones. The Kresh admiral tried to negotiate better terms, but Admiral Cole simply said these were the only terms available, and if they were not acceptable, then the battle would resume, and this time she would not offer surrender again. And the Kresh admiral looked at his shattered fleet and the human ships that were barely damaged and realized he had no choice but to accept. The Kresh fleet withdrew under human escort to ensure they actually left the sector, and did not simply regroup and attack again. And Jake finally allowed himself to relax slightly, and looked around his bridge at his exhausted crew and felt pride in what they had accomplished, even though the cost in Villani lives had been far too high. Admiral Cole contacted the Valkyrie directly, and congratulated Jake on his actions and told him that his decision to intervene had forced humanity to take a stand on an issue that the Galactic Council had been ignoring for too long, and that the recordings of Kresh war crimes were already spreading through galactic communication networks and creating political pressure that even the Council could not ignore. The Villani refugees were transferred to the carrier, where medical facilities were more extensive, and where they could begin the process of recovery and planning for their future. And Tharn spoke to Jake one final time before the transfer and said that his people would never forget what humanity had done, and that the Villani would make sure the galaxy knew the truth about the Deathworlders, who proved to be the most civilized species anyone had encountered. News of what became known as the Villani incident spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected, and other species began requesting information about humanity, and some asked about defensive alliances and trade agreements, and suddenly humans were no longer seen as primitive Deathworlders but as potential allies, who actually meant it when they talked about protecting the innocent. The Galactic Council was forced to hold emergency sessions and address the evidence of Kresh war crimes that humanity had presented, and several species who had previously supported Kresh expansion suddenly discovered urgent reasons to reconsider. Their positions and the balance of power in galactic politics shifted in ways that would take years to fully understand. The Kresh Dominion quietly withdrew from several border conflicts and stopped their aggressive expansion campaigns, and their leadership issued carefully worded statements about reviewing their military protocols and ensuring proper treatment of civilians. And everyone understood they were only backing down because they had finally met an opponent who would not be intimidated. Jake and his crew were decorated as heroes when they returned to human space, and reporters wanted interviews and politicians wanted photo opportunities. But Jake found all the attention uncomfortable because they had just done what they believed was right, and he could not understand why that was considered exceptional rather than expected behavior. When a reporter asked him why he had risked his ship and crew for strangers, Jake gave the same answer he had given Tharn and said that someone had to respond, and humanity knew what it meant to be helpless, and that they had decided a long time ago to be the kind of species that helped others rather than the kind that looked away when help was needed. The story spread through human space and beyond, carried by news services and word of mouth and entertainment media, and it became known simply as the Vellani incident, and children learned about it in schools and military academies used it as a